Are chemicals in our food a real danger, or is the fear greater than the risk? Welcome back to Rooted and Restless. I'm your host, Marianne Smith Edge. A common question that's often asked of me is, what's in my food and should I be concerned? And the concern is real, considering that we see the headlines around chemicals in food, food recalls, and the processing of food. Well, to help answer those questions, I have a wonderful expert, Dr. Liza Lockwood. Liza is an emergency medicine physician, a medical toxicologist, and the medical affairs lead at Bayer Company in St. Louis. She also has a long-term interest and work in tropical medicine and global health. So Lisa, with all those titles and responsibilities, thank you so much for finding time in your busy schedule to be a guest today.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
So I have to start with a favorite quote from a toxicologist. Okay, here we go. I was going to call him either everybody but what he is. So to start, so let's dive in. I want to start with a quote from Peter Salmon, a toxicologist that I have always appreciated, is that he talks about that the risks that the people are most concerned about are completely different than the risks that can actually kill people. So your background as a physician and toxicologist, I'd like to really for you to kind of unpack that statement to say what we are concerned or have fear versus what really kill us. What does that mean?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. One of the principles of toxicology is that the dose makes the poison. And I keep on hearing concerns like you do from people who are worried about trace residues of pesticides or different chemicals in their food, be it dyes or pesticides or plastic or contaminants. And that's really been a narrative that has gotten a lot of traction lately. The thing is, once again, the dose makes the poison. So let's maybe just address that a little bit. 99.99% of the pesticides that you eat every day are made by Mother Nature. And Mother Nature does that for plants. She makes natural chemicals for plants to defend themselves, since plants can't run away from predators. So, for example, apples have seeds in them, and the seeds have a coating on them that has a chemical, all natural, organic, that's called amygdalin. And amygdalin, when you chew a seed or get it into your stomach, will release a small dose of hydrogen cyanide. That's right. Mother Nature makes a cyanogenic compound. But once again, the dose makes the poison. And so we say an apple a day keeps the doctor away. And what she's doing is she's protecting her offspring to make sure you can have more apples, right? So to provide an abundance of food. We have taken some of the instructions from Mother Nature and made chemistries that have been very, very important in protecting our food supply. And so we've got, for example, the daisy, a class of daisies called Chrysanthemum cineifolium, makes an all-natural chemical called pyrethrum. And what pyrethrum does is it paralyzes the nerves of insects, but it doesn't bother us. And so it prevents insect attacks on that plant. We've been able to take pyrethrum and make it a little bit more light stable and less allergenic. And it has become a really, really effective way of preventing malaria. And we put bed nets. We put this pyrethroid, the synthetic version, on bed nets to protect children from mosquito-borne diseases. So we are really excited to be able to use Mother Nature's recipes to provide protection against diseases like malaria and protect our food supply with chemistries that are really, really important to make sure that we have the most abundant, affordable, and healthy food supply in the history of mankind.
Well, and I really appreciate you explaining, what's in our food. I know back in those days, Nutrition 300 was really talking about the toxins and, the greening of the potato, and some of those where, to your point, not going to kill you per se, but that there are some of those natural toxins in food. Yeah.
Yes, and they will make you miserable if you if you let them go a certain direction.
So when we talk about that's kind of and we know with the headlines, that is some of the concern that people come out. And as we talk about the dose makes a poison. And then Sandman talks about, well, those risks that could actually kill us. And sometimes I think about that more in the whole foodborne illness, those type of issues, which maybe doesn't get as much attention. Would you agree?
Yo, absolutely. We've got 10,000 years of experience with organic farming, and there's a romanticization of organic farming. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's just that we've only had food security for the past 50 years because of scientific advances in agriculture. And yes, there are other kinds of contaminants that you do need to worry about. You need to worry about microbial infections. You need to worry about fungicidal or fungus infections. So, for example, ergot, which is a fungus that infects rye and barley and wheat, has in the Middle Ages caused huge outbreaks of a disease called St. Anthony's fire. And what would happen is that the chemicals in this fungus would cause vasoconstriction. So the blood vessels to your arms and legs would get very, very constricted and cut off the blood supply, and people would get searing, burning pain in their extremities, and then they would turn black, necrose off, and fall off. You also had miscarriages, seizures, and vivid hallucinations with this crop contamination. And nobody knew what it was back in the 1600s. But once they started figuring this out, that it was this fungal infection of crops, they were able to isolate the different chemicals in that fungal infection and turn it into different things. So the first thing that they did was they were able to get a chemical out called ergonavine. And they made a synthetic version of it called methylergonavine. And that really wound up saving the lives of millions of women because it prevented postpartum hemorrhage. So one of the leading causes of death in women is bleeding after having a baby. This was able to make the vessels to the uterus contract, and it is still used today to prevent postpartum hemorrhage and really revolutionized obstetrics. And that was only in the 1930s that they discovered that. The other thing that comes out of that ergot is lysergic acid. And that is Mother Nature's version of LSD. And so when they were looking at the different components of the ergot, they made a synthetic version of lysergic acid, and that became LSD and launched the hippie movement. We do not want this fungus infecting our crops and having a widespread impact on people who consume those crops. There were 40,000, 50,000 deaths at a time with these outbreaks in the Middle Ages. And so this kind of chemical, you need fungal control and weed control to be able to prevent this infection of crops. You don't want LSD residues in your Rice Krispies or in your Wheaties. So the way
some might, but
some might, but most moms don't want their kids having LSD residues, and so it's interesting because the way you prevent this infection, this crop infection, is weeds About 400 species of grassy weeds harbor this fungus, and it's transmitted from the weeds to the crop by insects. The insects carry the spores, and then there's honeydew that attracts the fungus makes a honeydew that attracts these insects, and they spread it from plant to plant. And so the best way to prevent this is to prevent the weeds that harbor the fungus from growing in the first place. So you can control that with a herbicide, or prevent the insects from contaminating the crop, and that those get controlled with an insecticide. And like I said, some of the insecticides that we use, like pyrethroids, come originally from a daisy. And so that can prevent an infection, a fungal infection of the actual crop. Once you get into the crop, fungi actually pose a much more significant risk for significant outbreaks of things. Another fungus that's a big, huge problem is called Aspergillus, and it secretes a toxin called aflatoxin. And in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where there's very little crop protection, you see big outbreaks of aflatoxicosis. And aflatoxin is a liver toxin. It causes liver failure. It's a carcinogen. It causes liver cancer. And it's thought to contribute significantly to childhood malnutrition. So it's very important, once again, to control the weeds that harbor this fungus, the insects that transmit it, and try not to have to use the antifungals that you need for crops. If you can prevent it from the beginning, you don't have to deal with it once it's on the crop. So you want to prevent it from getting on the crop in the first place. So the chemistries that we use to prevent that are all heavily regulated to make sure that their trace residues are not going to cause harm to human health. So you need a very small amount of herbicide to control the weeds, insecticide to control the insects, and fungicide to control the fungus. And those really balance out the human health risks when you're talking about preventing significant contamination of food that goes to the population.
Well, I think you've described it so well, and the reality is that Mother Nature is really the laboratory. It's not, and we forget that there's a reason why things have existed in nature, and the detail so gives us you've explained it so well. And you mentioned residues. So, I just read recently, it was in a university publication that was highlighting that the U.S. uses 72 pesticides that are not allowed in the EU. And we know there's always a lot of questions around that. So I would say, does that mean that our standards are not the same as the EU, or how do we address that type of statement?
Yeah, so I hear that comment a lot as well. And I hear the comment that why do we propose that we should use a lot different chemistries in the tropics as opposed to the EU as well? Is that, what's happening in the tropics that's different? So I'm going to address this two ways. I'm going to start with the concept of hazard versus risk, and then we'll get into the EU versus U.S. discussion. But in the United States, we take a risk-based approach to our regulations. So most people think that the term hazard is a synonym of risk, but it really isn't. A hazard is some inherent property of a chemical or a thing, right? So if you can think about it this way, a shark is a hazard, right? Now, you will be at higher or lower of risk depending on your exposure to that shark. So if the shark's in the water and you're on the other side of a big, thick aquarium glass, you're at very low risk of having any problem with that shark. You'll put your kids in front of that shark, no problem, right? Now, the risk is not zero. The glass could break, right? There could be an exposure, but it's so low that we feel pretty comfortable bringing our kids to an aquarium. It's a much higher risk if you're, snorkeling and deciding to pat a school of of great white sharks, and that's a much higher risk of getting in trouble. And so, once again, the dose makes the poison. Hazard is different than risk. Risk is a function of exposure. Now, let's take this to pesticides, right? So pesticides are designed to help protect you, to minimize your risk from insect-borne illness, from rodent-borne illness, and to protect your food supply, to make sure you have the most affordable, abundant, and safe food supply. They're very heavily regulated to make sure that you're not going to have an exposure that's going to put you at higher risk. You're not going to have an exposure that's going to give you allergy or toxicity or cancer or endocrine disruption. Those tests are all built into why we to prevent those things from happening. And what they do is they optimize your health and optimize food security and protect you from Mother Nature. So anyway, we take a risk-based approach in the United States, and Europe takes a hazard-based approach. So Europe's position is that if something could, at some high dose, cause any harm, we're going to ban this. So, or we're not going to approve this. So let's talk about so that they take the precautionary principle. And what it does is it really makes it difficult for farmers in Europe to be able to make sure that they have adequate productivity to feed the European population. And so in the United States, we take a risk-based approach, and we know that, once again, the dose makes a poison, and you will never get a dose by any kind of residue that is going to cause acute or chronic illness from your ordinary everyday exposure to foods. Now, in terms of U.S. and Europe, a lot of the things that lose approvals in Europe are actually used in the U.S. But the reason why they lose approval in Europe is because of more like political pressure and popular concern rather than a scientific reason. And I will give you an example of a chemical that's been like that. So atrazine. Atrazine is a really important chemistry for protecting corn from weeds and things like that. Very, very low toxicity. And there was a claim made by a Berkeley researcher that atrazine exposure at high doses in frogs caused endocrine disruption and made male frogs turn female. That has never been replicated anywhere else. And literally millions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer money has gone into evaluating whether that claim is true. That particular researcher from Berkeley has refused to share his data in order to be able to evaluate that claim. So multiple millions of dollars of taxpayer money has gone into researching this claim. It has never been reproduced. Now, the Europeans were concerned about that claim as well, and they wound up doing multiple millions of dollars of European taxpayer money, and they have not either been able to reproduce that finding. But because of the population's concern, because of this one claim, they opted not to renew atrazine's licensing in Europe. They didn't ban it, but they opted not to renew it. But they did do, though, because farmers were like, we're going to not be able to grow our corn. This is really, really bad. They did say, well, you can use another chemical in the same class as atrazine. And so they use a very similar chemical for their crops. So to say that, something's banned in Europe and not in the United States is to overstate the case with this particular chemistry. So they use the same class of chemicals to manage their crops, and this claim has never been reproduced.
Now let's hear from Mindy Herman, registered dietitian, food and nutrition writer, and a guru on all the latest food trends.
Hi, Marianne. According to a survey by the International Food Information Council, about half of Americans are very or somewhat confident in the safety of the U.S. food supply. The U.S. Government Accountability Office notes that about 1 in 6 Americans get sick from a foodborne illness. Salmonella, Listeria, and E. coli are the top culprits, mainly from animal-based foods, and about half foodborne infections are from produce, where the most common bug is norovirus. In the U.S., the FDA monitors the food supply and uses the data to protect consumers from unsafe food. FDA's New Era of Smarter Food Safety Initiative aims to reduce the number of illnesses attributed to FDA-regulated foods. Consumers also can follow a few simple food safety practices, including washing hands before food prep, washing fruits and vegetables well, cooking foods to the proper temperature, keeping cold foods cold, and using a food thermometer.
Now, let's return to our conversation. Well, I think you bring up a couple of really good points. First is just because, just to kind of reiterate what you said, is that just because it may not be a particular chemical name doesn't mean that there's not something similar. And what you just gave was a perfect example. I think the second thing is what those of us that, have been trained to read studies, it's a little different than the headlines, is that we especially know with media at this point, something like what you just mentioned about atrazine and the frogs, it creates big headlines.
Exactly.
But if it's a study of 10 or a study of frogs in one isolated case, you can't say that is a cause and effect, so to speak. I mean, and that's where true. What you just mentioned is really doing the true studies and science on validation. Is that if you claim something, then I should be able to take the same methodology and get the same results.
That's right. That's right. And this is the time this has not been reproducible in big, huge studies. And in fact, there was a study that came out of South Africa that used looking at atrazine in real world exposures on crops, and the particular frog that this particular researcher was using, which came from South Africa, the frog did. And the frogs were thriving in South Africa. And so it's really important to make sure that a claim that tends to be sensational is actually backed up by reproducible studies. And this claim wasn't. And it's cost European farmers a tremendous amount and it's cost taxpayers a tremendous amount of money to try to reproduce these claims. The other thing about risk is that people are, once again, very, very precautionary and concerned about exposure, right? But folks don't think twice about taking the most potent toxin known to mankind, nanograms will kill you, botulinum toxin, and injecting it in our faces for cosmetic purposes. And they do that in Europe and they do that in the United States. Very potent neurotoxin. If you get it in your food, it's a source of food poisoning, and it routinely killed people before food safety acts were put in, right? And so we know that you can say, if you follow the label, you can safely inject this very potent neurotoxin in your face for cosmetic purposes, because the regulation around it is so rigorous and so robust that you can do it safely if you follow the directions. Aflatoxin that we just talked about is the second most potent toxin known to mankind after botulinum toxin. And so we have the ways, we've got methods for controlling and preventing aflatoxin exposure in populations. And so it's really, really important to put that into perspective when we're talking about food safety.
Well, to your point about Botox, even though I may need it, it's the food safety side in me, botulism, that I'm like, no, not going there. The whole aspect is of learning those risks early on. That has kind of like, I'm staying away. Well, one other question, you've alluded to that around the EU, but I think just to especially when it comes to beyond the pesticides, but when it comes to food colorings like red dye 3 or additives like a BHT, I always get these comments, well, again, and I'm sure it's similar to what you just mentioned, but why don't Europe have these ingredients, and why are we still using them in our food?
So food dye, food coloring makes things fun and appealing, right? So we use food dye to decorate our Easter eggs. No worries about that whatsoever. I still decorate Easter eggs, which is fine. Food dyes in our diet have all been rigorously tested to make sure that they're not going to cause harm. The Europeans also use food dyes, and they use them under different names than ours, and under different categories than ours. There are some food dyes that are not used in Europe that are used in the United States. Once again, rigorously tested, not going to cause harm. But there are also many food dyes that are used in Europe that are not used in the United States. Certain green dyes are not used in Europe, not used in the United States, but are used in Europe. And so the discussion about the dyes is really unfortunate because it's just fear mongering. It's not; these are not going to cause harm in the doses that you get. So I think it's just an example of something to distract people from, real issues of food security, and you make headlines that way.
Exactly. I always say moderation's not, is doesn't make the headlines, right? In that regard.
No, that's exactly right.
So I'm curious in all this discussion that, of course, we've had for years, and of course in the last several months, about what we've just talked about, residues and what's in our food. At the same time, earlier this week, I read where the EPA was proposing to relax the regulations around quote unquote forever chemicals, I think called PFAS, in drinking water. So as a toxicologist, I'm curious, should we be concerned about the quote forever chemicals or the relaxing of limitations in our drinking water?
And so the regulations about the drinking water are so incredibly low, like a part per trillion, which is like a drop in 26 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The dose makes it poison. They are not, the claim that it's relaxing is not, I don't think it's legit. The doses, the regulatory standard was so low that it would make it really impossible to clean things up to that level. In fact, I read an article once, and you might want to look it up. It's really interesting. It's called In Real Clear Health, and it's entitled, You May Be Entitled to Compensation. And that article estimates that it would cost $106 trillion to get to that level of remediation to clean up the trace residues of PFAS. And there are only two PFASs, it's a class of chemicals, of concern, and those are concern when it's a high dose. There, when you're getting exposed to a fluoridated compound in a low dose, you're not going to have any kind of issue with it. So, and once again, lots of taxpayer money has gone into investigating this. I think that when we hear these claims and people get very concerned about these claims, what it does is it redirects taxpayer money from really important research to these kinds of things, and at the expense of really important research. So, for example, we keep on hearing the idea that there's an epidemic of chronic diseases, heart disease, obesity, cancer, strokes, those kinds of things. And the claim is that it's the way we grow and process our food that's contributing to that. Well, I will tell you that there's an idea that we need to go back to organic and old style farming to fix those problems. So there were 5 public health advances of the 20th century that brought us an unprecedented 35-year increase in life expectancy. So in 1900, 45% of our population farmed. Most of them were subsistence farmers doing purely organic farming. And we lived to the ripe old age of 45. By the end of the century, despite 2 world wars and massive famines in Russia and China that killed close to 100 million people, we had added an unprecedented 35-year increase in life expectancy. And those 5 public health advances of the 20th century were the water sanitation, so using chemistries like fluoride to make sure your teeth were okay, because bad teeth are associated with cardiovascular disease, and chlorine to make sure that you killed organisms that were fecal that caused terrible illnesses like cholera and typhoid that routinely killed people. The discovery of antibiotics cured strep and staph infections that routinely killed children. Vaccines prevented diphtheria, which killed children all the time, and smallpox. It eradicated smallpox. Huge outbreaks of really devastating disease. If you survived it, you wound up with terrible disfiguration. Food security, and we've talked a little bit about the food security, and vector control. The leading cause of death in most of the world is insect-borne illness. 750,000 to 1 million people die every year from insect-borne illness. The plague is endemic to California, Southern California, and 1 or 2 people get the plague every year. And it's carried by rodents and transmitted by fleas to people and other animals. When people get it, if they get the lung version of it, the pneumonic version of it, it's 100% fatal if it's not treated within 24 hours. So you can imagine that control of this disease is really important. And how do we prevent it? With a little bit of synthetic chrysanthemum spray and vitamin D to control rodents. The same vitamin D that you make in your skin when sunlight hits your skin, and a high dose will control rodents. And so the notion that pesticides are causing these chronic problems is not accurate. And so what I don't want to see happen, because many of these pesticides have been around for decades and decades and decades, and they've had just an incredible amount of research go around them. I hate to see money being diverted into rehashing what we already know and the regulatory agencies already know, and not going into the research to cure cancer or to cure diabetes. There's some really incredible research going on. And the reason why we're seeing this uptick in these chronic diseases is because we're mortal. We're living long enough to get them. And so going back to and romanticizing the diseases of the Middle Ages will just set us back. So hopefully people can take that away and understand how important it is to be scientifically based. We have the safest, most abundant, most affordable, and healthiest food supply in the history of mankind. And I'd like to keep it that way.
Well, and likewise, and I think you've given us a great overview. I think sometimes the absence of public health problems that you have alluded to suddenly feels like, well, maybe we don't need the prevention, which there's a reason why there's the absence. And, growing up on a dairy farm a few decades ago, I can definitely see the advancements of the fact that we control more with less in so many directions in that regard. So to finish up, you've, I think, a couple of insights thinking about putting in the real world, and we talk about how disease can be transmitted by food and by insects. And so I think it's kind of interesting that maybe this gives us a little bit more meaning why, especially when you travel outside of the country and you come back in and there's big signs about, do not carry in any food. I think you give us a little bit more. You've set the stage, but the seriousness, why should we be concerned?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So once again, we have to protect our agriculture. A lot of times, diseases that are in other places can come if you're on farms and things like that, or bringing in fruits and vegetables from another place without proper regulation. You can inadvertently bring in diseases. And one of the things that I lived in Ireland for a while, and there was a big outbreak of foot and mouth disease. And so you had to be careful from not bringing that into farms in the United States, because it can devastate our own livestock and things like that. We've also there's an epidemic of screwworm, I think, is it in Mexico? And I think they're concerned about that coming to Texas cattle. And so you have to be very careful about pandemics. We're all in this together. This is an example of One Health. The things that affect our livestock and our crops can also affect us in terms of our health and in terms of our food security. And so it's very, very important to have rules and regulations about transnational trade. And if you're bringing in things from on your own, it can introduce pathogens to our livestock and our crops, and we want to prevent that from happening. So it's very important to follow the rules, and that's what FDA and EPA they do when we're talking about agricultural commodities coming to and from the United States, and this pertains to everywhere in the world. It's not just the United States. It's interesting also. Getting back to a little bit of kind of sub-Saharan Africa, one of the concerns that I hear from people in the West is that, oh my gosh, they use chemicals that we won't allow use in the United States. And why is that happening? Well, the United States and Europe have the best pesticide ever, and it's called winter. And it kills weeds and insects and things like that. When you have insect pressure, 365 days a year, 24/7, you need multiple modes of action for controlling those insects. And those insects, once again, can kill up to about 1 million people a year. And with climate change, with global warming, we're seeing invasive insects like the Aedes mosquito moving further and further north. The Aedes mosquito showed up in the United States in 1984 in Texas and some tires, and has moved all the way up to New York. The Aedes mosquito carries viral diseases that generally don't have vaccines, and can be very deadly. So dengue is a hemorrhagic fever. Ebola is a hemorrhagic fever. Dengue is a hemorrhagic fever that is carried by this mosquito. It also carries Eastern equine encephalitis, and there was an outbreak of that. I want to say in New York or Massachusetts this past year, and people got very concerned about that. The Aedes mosquito has made its inaugural appearance to Europe about 2 years ago. So if you have in the developing world trying to control these kinds of insects with only one or two modalities, they can build resistance, and they'll take that resistance with them north. And so it's very important to have integrated pest management, not just only relying on insecticides and things like that, but multiple modes of action to prevent human suffering.
Well, you've given us a really broad view, and I think one of the things is that the reality is, as we say in any type of food safety, food safety is in our hands, whether it's from what we do in the kitchen to following some of the guidelines we're traveling, or realizing the importance of prevention, I think is really important. So as we wrap up, I guess people could listen and say, oh my gosh, I can't get out of the house. Or at the same time, also say, I'm glad that we have all of these items and that we have the research to be able to protect us. So back to, from a toxicologist and a physician standpoint, what would be your one word of advice when people say, I'm concerned about what's really in my food?
We, once again, have the safest, most abundant, and affordable food supply in the history of mankind. We are so lucky to have access to the kinds of technology that we have that can provide that for you. If you're concerned about residues, wash your fruits and vegetables. But outside of that, the dose makes the poison. You are not being poisoned by your food.
Well, thank you. And the risk is more not eating fruits and vegetables than,
That's right.
and then the fact of what might be the residue in that regard. So, well, Liza, it truly was a pleasure giving us so much food for thought. And I think, if anything, is sometimes relax when you see the headlines, read below the headlines, and realize there's still be practical and some common sense when we think about evaluating risk versus hazard, and knowing what's in our food, is that there are checks and balance systems along the way. So exactly. Thank you so much, Liza. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Rooted and Restless. It's all about digging deeper into the behind the scenes about food, agriculture, and nutrition, because after all, every food has a story, and sometimes it's not as simple as it seems. Subscribe to Rooted and Restless wherever you listen to podcasts, or find us on YouTube.